Most people expect the days after an eclipse to feel disruptive, but shifts that matter rarely feel dramatic. They usually feel like something is just quietly losing its hold on you. And over the last few days, many people have been noticing exactly that. Not big decisions, not confrontations, just a subtle change in how certain situations feel. Something that used to require effort suddenly doesn't, or conversations that once carried tension now feel strangely neutral, or dynamics that previously pulled your attention now feel optional. And that can feel confusing at first because we're used to thinking that meaningful change requires a decision. But something very different tends to happen during periods like this. Over the last few days, a lot of people have been sensing a kind of quiet or silence internally. Not disengagement, not emotional shutdown, just a sense that certain patterns no longer require the same level of participation. And what's interesting is that nothing external may have changed at all. The same people, the same situations, the same circumstances, but internally, something's reorganized. And that is where the real shift begins, because what's actually happening during periods like this is something I refer to as structural recalibration, where the internal architecture that used to organize your reactions starts to change. And when that structure changes, behavior naturally follows, not from willpower and not through forcing yourself to act differently, because the pattern that once required that effort is no longer active in the same way. Here's where this often shows up in a very simple way. You might find yourself in a conversation that used to pull you into explanation or emotional tension. And suddenly you notice you're just listening. You're present. You're not pulled in the same way. You're neutral. Nothing about the conversation changed, but your participation in it did. That's usually one of the first signs that internal structure has shifted. And it often happens quietly because the deeper recalibrations in our lives rarely announce themselves with a lot of drama. They show up as small moments where we simply stop operating the same way. This can show up in relationships, in work dynamics, in the way you prioritize your time or energy. You may notice situations where you once felt responsible for managing the outcome, and now you just don't feel that pull anymore. Not because you made a conscious decision, but because something inside you has already reorganized. And this is why the days following an eclipse can feel so subtle. People expect the shift to be the event, but the event is usually just the moment where the illusion dissolves. The real change happens afterwards, in how we relate to things that once felt fixed or locked. And one of the deeper truths here is that not every meaningful shift requires a decision. We're often taught that change comes from choosing something different. But some of the most powerful recalibrations happen when the internal structure that sustained the pattern simply disappears. Sometimes that shift happens automatically during larger cycles like eclipses, and sometimes it happens consciously when the architecture behind how we're perceiving something is shifted. When that happens, the decision becomes unnecessary. You don't need to enforce a new behavior. You simply stop engaging in the old one. So if the last few days have felt quieter or more still inside you, if you've noticed certain situations no longer carrying the same weight that they once did, that's not something to be concerned with. For most of you, it's not disengagement or separation. It's structural clarity emerging. It's your internal system reorganizing and your behavior starting to follow that new architecture. So how can you work with this? Over the last couple of days, notice where your participation in certain dynamics has already shifted. Not where you made a decision, but where something simply stopped requiring your energy. And in the days ahead, pay attention to where you're no longer operating the same way. We often don't recognize these shifts until we look back later. So if you'd like to continue exploring these patterns, feel free to subscribe. We'll be looking at how this unfolds as we move closer to the equinox, particularly in the area of relationships. I'm Katya, and I'll see you in the next one.